My name is Sherma Muller and I am the Marketing Associate here at Inova. We would like to thank everyone for joining our webinar, and we would like you guys to know that we value your presence. Today we will be talking about our webinar, Disaster Recovery. That's why you need options for disaster recovery. And we have the man himself, none other than Jasper, to provide a presentation for you guys. We'll start with the welcome and introduction. We'll move on to the presentation, and then we'll have the Q&As and the closure. I hope you guys enjoy. Jasper?
Good morning, everybody from all over the Caribbean.
Not hearing anything.
So currently I sit on Aruba. I don't know where all you guys are sitting, but I see some people from Trinidad and from Curacao, so we're all over the place. I'm Jasper, I'm Dutch. I came to the Caribbean about 5 years ago and worked for Inova since then. And I'm a Microsoft certified trainer, and I've been doing Azure and Office 365 for 6 or 7 years now. So I think I know something about it. So let's start with the real content. There is somebody not muted, and I hear a lot of noise. If you have a question, you can either type it in the conversation box or unmute and just interrupt me. That's fine with me. But I see Omar Reed, your microphone is not muted. Could you please mute that, please? Okay, so let's kick off with some general things on backup and disaster recovery. So we have to keep in mind that backup is in the context of disaster recovery. So backup is the preparation for a restore of something that broke or failed. And backup is not the same as archiving. Archiving is in the context of compliance, where there is a need for that you are able to look up documents or reports that were created 7 years ago for audit purposes or fiscal purposes or whatever. But it's not the same. You can use some of the same technologies, but it's definitely not the same. It probably does not make sense to keep a backup of a SQL database for 5 years, because you will never restore that database to a point in time 5 years ago. The report that are generated out of that SQL database, you might have compliance regulations in place that force you to keep the reports for audit purposes. So that's a really big difference. Now, you also should look at what do you back up. So in the old days, when we had physical servers, we backed up the complete server. But now with all the virtualization technologies, that is not necessary, because redeploying a server on HyperV or VMware or on VirtualBox, redeploying a server is way faster than doing a restore. And so you only do backup of configuration and data. So your footprint for your backup becomes way smaller, because you don't back up the complete server. You just back up the configuration and the data, and you redeploy the server. There's a couple of Microsoft servers that have that built in. So domain controllers, Exchange servers, SharePoint servers, SQL servers, they have built-in systems for doing just that. You don't restore an Exchange server. You redeploy the Exchange server and you restore the database, and then you're back to normal again. So be careful with that. The best practices that were valid 10 years ago, they are definitely not valid nowadays. Things are changing. Then we need to talk about these two things, and each cover, so the recovery time objective is actually two things. It is a statement, and the business should make that statement. If something happens, how long does it take before you are up and running again? So the whole restore process, how long does that take? Let's take Exchange, for example. In Exchange, we can define two different time objectives. The first one would be that mail services are working again. So you can receive mail and you can send mail, but you don't have access yet to your entire mailbox. And then the second point for the recovery time objective in Exchange would be, how long does it take before you have access to your complete mailbox again? So that is really, and for the IT department, for the IT people in this call, it is really, really necessary that you practice the restore process at least once a month. Because when shit happens, your manager will be staring over your shoulder and pressuring you on fixing it. And if you are fixing it and he is looking over your shoulder, but you first have to Google on how to fix it, that's not good for your reputation. Then we have the recovery point objective. So the recovery point objective means how frequent, well, also two things. How frequent do you make a backup? In other words, how much data do you lose if you have to perform a restore? So if you make a backup once every day, worst case scenario is that you lose 23 hours and 59 minutes of data when you perform a restore. On the other hand, if you would make a backup every hour, that will consume a lot of CPU power and a lot of disk space. So you have to go somewhere in between those. How often do you make a snapshot of your systems? And the other thing about the recovery point objective is the retention. How long do you keep your backups? So we can go up to 99 years. I don't think that makes sense. I already gave the example of a SQL database. I don't think 12 years from now you will be restoring a database of which you made a backup today. So that is something to figure out as well. How long should we keep different backups from different servers, from different workloads, of course. So keep those. So we have the RTO and the RPO, and both cover two different things. And then we have for end users, there's a lot of self-service available in all kinds of products, either on premises in file servers or online in SharePoint and OneDrive. So there is something on file servers that's called previous versions, and as an IT administrator you just have to enable that, and then if people accidentally remove files or corrupt files or whatever, they can browse themselves for previous versions of that same file. And of course we have recycle bins, and so give those actions back to the organization. It doesn't make sense if they call the help desk and say, hey, I accidentally deleted a file yesterday, can you please restore that? End users are perfectly capable of doing that themselves if you give them the appropriate tools, of course. So keep that in mind. Any questions so far? I don't think so, so I will just continue. So this is just a couple of all the stuff that is available in Azure, the Microsoft Cloud, and we will focus on two items out of that whole thing, and that is backup and site recovery. So both sit in that context of disaster recovery. So the simple version of Azure Backup. So remember again, this is not about archiving, this is about disaster recovery, and it's about preparing for a restore. So first of all, you need to sign up for Azure. You must have an Azure subscription, and the sign up process is pretty straightforward. You go to portal.azure.com and you sign up and you pay the money, or you get your subscription through your enterprise agreement, or you get your subscription through Inova. We're a cloud solution provider, so we can provide you with Azure subscriptions as well. So you sign up and then you install the Azure Backup Agent on your server. It also works on Windows 10. So you just download and install that little agent, and in the wizard on that agent, you will automatically register and configure that backup vault, that little sign in the cloud with the key lock in there. You register and you configure, and there you go. You start backing up your encrypted data. So if you have a large server with, let's say, 5 terabytes of data, you don't want to put that over the internet. That will take like 4 ages to get your stuff in the cloud, uploading 5 terabytes of data. So there is something called offline seeding, where you put that data on a removable hard drive, and then you call DHL or FedEx, and you ship that disk to a Microsoft data center. They will mount that initial backup for you in your vault, and then you only do the incremental backups over the internet. You could do the same with a restore, because if you really start to use Azure Backup and you have like 30 or 40 terabytes of data sitting in the cloud and you really have a disaster, you're not going to download 40 terabytes of data. So then you send some disks to an Azure data center with the request to put the backups on those disks, and you ship them back home. So then you can recover those files to the same or to a different server. If the whole server collapsed and is on fire, then you can just put that back up on a different server. So this is very simple. This is about an individual server. So probably you have more than one server. So if you have like 10 servers, you would have to do this trick 10 times. And of course, that is not very efficient. So if you have a larger server farm, then we should go to the next slide, if there's no questions. No questions, so I'll just move on to the next slide. And here we make it a little bit more complex. So here we talk about a product called Azure Backup Server. And for the Microsofties amongst us, actually Azure Backup Server is a System Center product. It's System Center Data Protection Manager in a bit tuned down version, but it's part of System Center. So if you are already using System Center, you can do cloud Azure backup from the system you have already running. If you're on VM or other big providers of backup software, they all know how to use the Azure cloud nowadays. So initially the process is the same. You sign up, you get yourself a subscription, but this time you don't just install an agent, you download and install Azure Backup Server software. And you install that on a centralized server in your data center, and that server needs a lot of disk space, because initially from all those little servers you see in the left-hand corner, you first make a backup on disk. And then you go from disk to the cloud. So you do the registration and the configuration, and then you start backing up. And on those local disks, you will keep like 5 or maybe even 10 days of backups locally for quick restore. So if a SQL database gets corrupted, or if your SharePoint farm gets infected by some ransomware thing, you don't have to download anything, because that short-term backup is still located on premises. So you have high-speed network connections. And then once it's in the cloud, and of course the same applies over here with the offline seeding, you're probably not gonna upload your complete backup of your complete data center over the internet. Unless of course you have like really terrific black fiber internet connections, but I don't think so. They are pretty scarce in the Caribbean. So offline seeding is the way to go. You purchase yourself a couple of big disks, nothing special about those disks, just big disks, and then you send them through FedEx or DHL to a Microsoft data center. Any questions on this scenario? So it's a bit more complex, and especially the whole configuration of that Azure backup software. That is quite a precise thing. Remember, in the cloud, you pay for what you actually use. So if you just go through those wizards by next, finish, you may consume way more than you actually need. So remember those things from one of the first slides on the recovery time objective and the recovery point objective. Those things from the business case perspective represent money. The shorter you want to have your recovery time objective, the more money you have to pay, and the same applies to the recovery point objective. The shorter you want to have that, and the more recovery points you want to have available, the more money you pay, and the more disk space you need. Any questions so far? I see nobody typing, I see nobody unmuting, trying to shout something to me, so I will just continue. Because here we get into a bit more complex scenario, but I think in the Caribbean, oh, somebody's typing a message. All good so far. Okay, good. So when you create a backup as preparation for a restore, you assume that you still have hardware on which you can actually perform the restore. But the Caribbean was hit by a couple of hurricanes last year. So we had quite some customers that just didn't have anything to restore to. So it was very nice that they had their backup tapes somewhere, or maybe even already in the cloud. But hey, the server room was gone. So what then? Because procuring new servers and installing that and stuff like that, that will take you at least a couple of weeks before the shipments arrived and you have everything hooked up again. So larger organizations may already have 2 data centers, a hot one and a cold one, or a hot one and a warm one, or even a load balanced one where both the data centers are hot. So now I'm talking about the left side of this picture. You can perform the orchestration of failover through the Microsoft Cloud. So the Microsoft Cloud will recognize, hey, there is no connectivity left to the left-hand data center. What is the trigger? If that lasts for longer than 30 seconds or 1 minute, we're going to initiate a failover. That's interesting stuff. But I think for a lot of organizations in the Caribbean, they are just not big enough to allow for having 2 data centers. But hey, we can with Azure, and now I go to the right-hand side of the picture. In the Azure cloud, you can set up a recovery site in Azure. So all of your servers, all of your data will be available in Azure. Most of the servers will not be running. You just replicate the data and keep the servers synchronized with your VMware servers or your HyperV servers on premises. And when it's needed to do a failover, you can do the failover. And you spin up all the servers in Azure, and you can automate that. I will explain a little bit more in the next slide. And within an hour or maybe 4 hours, depending on how much automation you use, you can spin up all your servers in Azure, and business is good to go. So if your whole data center is lost, then at least your services and your servers are up and running, and maybe even you can send some key people to places where internet connectivity is at least working. So at least you can continue your business. So that is it is funny since those hurricanes hit some of the islands really bad last year in September. Some customers said to me, "Oh, we're definitely not going to the cloud. We keep everything on premises because we had no internet connectivity for at least 10 days." And other customers are exactly the opposite. They say, "We want never again have stuff on premises because we lost our whole data center. Who cares about connectivity if there's nothing to connect to?" So, and of course everything in between there. So that's a hard choice to make. You're either on the side that you don't want to rely on internet connectivity, and on the other hand, you don't want to be on the side where you have to rely on nature forces that can just kill your whole data center. So maybe there are some nice in the middle options as well. Yeah, I'll go. I see a question over here. Bandwidth requirement for Azure replication. So I'll dig into that a little bit in the next slide, where we drill in really a little bit deeper. Might be a bit too technical, but I just don't want to miss out on this opportunity to try and explain a little bit how Azure Site Recovery works. So this is a pretty complex slide. So let's just start on the left-hand side. That is your data center. And in your data center, you have a couple of servers running, and it says there Hyper-V host. That can be a VMware host as well. That really doesn't matter, but you have server 1, server 2, server 3. Those are virtual machines. They are running your line of business applications, your web front-end servers, whatever. So then we use a technology with Hyper-V called HyperV Replica with VMware. I don't know the exact word, but it's the same technology. So you replicate those virtual machines to Azure. And here again, your initial replication, you will use offline seeding for that. So you're not going to upload that to the cloud over the internet. That is just not doable. So the initial replica will be on physical disks, and you ship them to a Microsoft data center. They will mount them for you. But those servers, if we keep focusing on those servers, and we'll go to the right-hand side of this slide, they are not running in Azure. So they don't consume CPU and RAM and stuff like that, so you pay nothing. You pay a little bit for the storage, but storage is actually pretty cheap in Azure. We'll get into that later on. So you just make sure that you have up-to-date replicas of your virtual machines that you have in your local data center. But then, in order to spin up those servers, if a disaster occurs, a couple of servers must already be running there. So on the left-hand side, we have, on the bottom, we have Active Directory, so your domain controllers and your DNS servers. So there must be a domain controller and a DNS server up and running all the time on the Azure side. So Azure is actually a warm standby site. There are some services up and running. And the same applies, for example, for SQL Server. Your data must already be there. So the SQL Server is probably the backend of server 1, server 2, and or server 3. And when you spin server 1 and 2 and 3 up on the Azure side, it would be very nice if the data is already there. So for that, we have a technology, and that's called SQL Server Availability Groups, and that makes sure that the data is already there. So now we can talk a little bit on the bandwidth requirements, and that of course really depends on your server 1, 2, and 3 on the incremental change on those servers. And the same applies to your databases. So you can measure that. And then if you measure that, you can also determine how much bandwidth you would need to set this up. So I cannot tell you because I have no clue about your situation, but it's something that you can calculate. Because you know exactly how your network, how your servers, how they are doing when it comes to disk I/O and whatsoever. Maybe you don't know it out from the top of your head, but you can measure it. You can just activate some performance counters and let them run for a month. And then you have a nice average of how much data is going in and out. And that data, of course, needs to go to Azure as well. So it's calculation. So the part of the AD and the DNS, that is no traffic. That is not a problem at all. And for the SQL Server, if you have very large databases, you will do offline seeding, of course, and you will only do the transactions. So we do something that is called log shipping, or actually use the SQL availability groups for that. And all that data will be compressed, of course. No, sizing, here's a question on the sizing. No, sizing is very hard. So there are some cost estimators out there. The thing is, for us being a cloud solution provider, so we can hook you up with a subscription for Azure, we can never make you a quote. Because on Azure, you pay afterwards for what you actually used. So we can only give a very rough estimation. And if you are starting to build this out, in the beginning, the cost will probably be lower because you probably will not start immediately with your complete data center. We'll have to put that in stages. And then let's say we make it a 3-month project, and after 3 months, you are completely up and running, and then costs will stabilize. So no, sizing, and actually the same applies to sizing for your local data center. Sizing is always underestimated. I know a lot of companies that have really, they bought, in general, we buy way too much. We don't know how to fine tune, so we just fill servers with RAM and CPU, and then you look at the performance counters, and then you see that the server has a load of like 10% or 20%. No, if you do decent sizing, a server load should always be 60% or 70%. Then get value for your money. So no, sizing is very hard, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of calculation on, hey, what are your servers doing, and maybe it's wise to upgrade some of your line of business applications because they are just sloppy. I know a couple of legacy applications that really they should be rest in peace. I mean, yeah. So there's a lot to say about that. So that if you're really interested in that, we should take this conversation offline and have a face-to-face or on Skype and discuss the options and the obstacles that need to be removed. So let's go back a little bit to the picture here on the right-hand side. We have recovery plans. So what do you want to recover? And then we have something called Azure Traffic Manager and failover routing rule and Azure automation. So it is possible to automate this for 100%. So Azure will determine, oh, now it's time to do the failover. And they do that in a very simple way. They just continuously ping one of your servers in your local data center. And if that ping is not getting a response, then you set a trigger for 1 minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever. And then Azure will just automate it. Will take care of everything, of your DNS settings, of spinning up those servers, attaching them to your SQL databases, make sure that your Active Directory and DNS is up and running. So that's really cool. But that takes a while to configure, of course. So this was a tough one, maybe for a couple of you, but I hope you get the greater picture on hey, if you have like 100 users and more than 15 or 20 servers, consider the worst case scenario that the whole building you are sitting in is destructed by fire or flooding or a hurricane or whatever. What happens to your business then? Then setting this up, and maybe not for your complete data center, but just your primary line of business servers that at least you can keep on serving your customers and stuff like that. So it's really something to consider in the context of continuity of your business. Not even continuity of your IT, but really continuity about your business. I travel to Puerto Rico pretty frequently, and there's a lot of people going out of business over there right now because the whole infrastructure is still, it's not there. So you walk through complete streets with shops on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, and everything is shut down. And that is such a waste. Any questions so far? Because I have, I think, one more slide, and then we're up for the real Q&A if there's anything left. So I will just move on to the next one. And that is about pricing. So pricing for Azure Backup. So that's not the Azure Recovery side, but really for Azure Backup, that's pretty straightforward. It's one of the only services in Azure where we can actually make a quite good estimate. So if we look at the dark blue block, cost per protected instance, so that is each server. So if you use the Azure Backup server, we're not talking about each Azure Backup server, but each server in your virtualization platform that is being managed by the Azure Backup server. So you pay per protected instance either $5 per month, $10 a month, or depending on how large the instance is, $10 per month per 500 gigs. So hey, that's an easy calculation. That is what you pay. Then on top of that, you pay $24 per month per terabyte if you use locally redundant storage. So that means that your data sits in at least 2 Microsoft data centers in the same region. If that is not protection enough, you can also choose to use global replication, and that means your data will be in at least 4 Microsoft data centers in 2 different regions. So the closest regions for us in the Caribbean is of course the US. If you're afraid of some disasters happening in the US, you can choose to have your secondary data in Singapore or Australia or Japan or wherever. Then there is, for the Azure Backup Vault, there is no charges for restore. So outbound bandwidth, no, you only pay for what's above the orange bar. So you don't pay for storage transaction, and you don't pay for the Azure Backup Server. So as soon as you sign up for that Azure Backup Server, because it includes a SQL Server instance, you don't pay for that. You have to pay for a Windows license though to install that Azure Backup Server software on. So it will cost you 1 server, and as I mentioned, a lot of disk space on that server. Any questions on this one? This is the easiest thing to do the sizing and the pricing for Azure Backup in the whole Azure thing. Okay, so this is not very informative slide. Some URLs, and you can always email me. But I think on the next page, this is maybe more interesting. On Tuesday, February 6th, so that is about 10 days from now, we'll do face-to-face deep dive on Azure Disaster Recovery in our local offices. So that means on Aruba, in Ecuador, in Jamaica, and in Trinidad. And Sherma, can you maybe paste those URLs in the conversation box as well? If you have a mobile phone with you, you can just scan the QR code, and then you will have the URL as well. But they are already in the conversation box. And probably, Sharma, you will also put them in the thank you email together with a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation. So you will have those. So then we have 2 hours, and depending on the number of people, we can really have a deep dive on what it would take your organization to start using Azure Backup or Azure Site Recovery. Then I think I give the word back to Sharma, unless of course we really need to do some Q&A. So unmute, not all together, and or type something in the conversation box. Let's see if there are some interesting questions popping up in your minds.
Hello, Jasper. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you vaguely, but just good enough.
Okay, perfect. So my question is regarding a conversation that I had with one of Microsoft Azure experts, whatever, on yesterday actually. They told me, hey, the easiest way so you can start, I guess, not having the conversation, but preparing the client to have a backup in Azure is the thing that I mentioned, the recovery site. Obviously, as you know, I'm not a technical expert, and I know you also are very busy with different things around different countries. So what would be the easy way to say, like, hey, we have this rough approximation or sizing that could be the things that you're going to go to Azure. Hey, Jasper, this is what it came out. What do you think we should do with this? Like, what I'm talking about is a way to help you accelerate that process.
Yeah, well, my first argument is always depending a little bit on the size of the customer, of course, but start with doing a training on Azure. I mean, if somebody has never touched Azure and this is your first experience ever logging into portal.azure.com, and then you expect to have Azure Site Recovery set up in 5 days, that's setting yourself up for failure. So step one is do some training. There are free training resources on Microsoft Virtual Academy or wherever on the internet. Take a trial account, spin up some trial servers, virtual machines. You can do that on your Windows 10 machine and play around with it. I really think it's setting yourself up for failure if with a first contact with a customer is, hey, I want to do Azure Backup Server or Azure Site Recovery, and I want it done before the end of the month. That is just not going to work. We're really talking about business continuity and fairly complex infrastructure stuff. So it really depends on the available knowledge that the customer already has. I mean, to be honest, I know we have a couple of customers, and in my humble opinion, they live in the Stone Ages. They are still running physical servers, all of them, nothing virtualized. Then it's a huge step to go to Azure Site Recovery at once. So my first contact with a customer will always be trying to hear what is your level of experience and knowledge for having a real conversation. I mean, I have conversations with customers on Azure, and the only thing they know is how to spell it. Then we're having a tough conversation. And I also have customers where they attended the training and they are already using other Azure stuff. And then you can have a decent conversation on, okay, hey, what's next? How do we approach this and by when can it be done? So, and I'm biased, I know that because I'm a Microsoft certified trainer, but really everything begins with training. This is not just something you implement. It's not like installing Office.
I completely agree with you with the training thing, Jasper. Do you have anything like any material that you can provide me so I can give that to the customers that we already have? I mean, the customers that are planning on getting furniture.
The best resource is Microsoft Virtual Academy. Just put that in Google or in Bing, and you will get the URL immediately. It's all for free in there. There's videos, there's training, there is really introductions in 15 minutes, and there is deep level training that will take you 6 hours to complete. And then of course there is, for the other people, they might not know it, but Mario is actually a colleague of mine. He sits in Puerto Rico, and I think I will be in Puerto Rico in March to deliver the 5-day Azure training for IT pros.
Just recently, I was speaking with a client about that, and he's really interested in going to that training. But he did mention that for that date, it's kind of late because they are worried about the hurricane season that starts on June. So they should be ready for that.
Yeah. I get that. I get that. So they have to train fast, not sooner but faster. We'll get there. We can start with customers like that before they take the training, but we will not deploy anything before the training. So training comes before deployment.
Okay.
I see another question. Besides delay in obtaining hardware and electricity supply, what are the challenges? Well, internet connectivity for one, and of course there's also a lot of stuff going on more in the privacy. So employees just not being able to come to work because they have no home. So that is not really a business concern. But hey, if your employees cannot come to work because the roads are blocked or they have to feed their family and do their groceries walking and get water from a well 5 kilometers down the road, then apparently your employees will not come into office. And on the other hand, what happens if so let's take that question back to really disaster recovery. So suppose you had a decent on-premises backup and restore solution, but you lost your whole data center. Chances are good that you also lost your backup tapes, depending on where they were. But if you have the custom of taking them home once a week and your house is destroyed as well, or those tapes are wet, then your backup is gone as well. So then you have nothing. So that's another good argument to put your backups in the cloud, where the cloud provider will make sure that it is kept in at least 2 data centers. And I emphasize on at least 2 because probably it will be at least 3, and if you choose for the global redundancy, it will be at least 4. So if you really want to know more, because Aruba is in the southern Caribbean, we never get hit by hurricanes. But if you want to know more, you should contact Mara or Mario. They are both in this call as well, and they are both from Puerto Rico. So and Puerto Rico was hit hard, so they can tell you all the ins and outs about that. But I know from another colleague that she put on WhatsApp just a couple of weeks ago that after 116 days she finally had electricity back in her home. So, but talk to those people. They know way more about it, because I'm a spoiled brat living on Aruba, and we're way too much to the south and way too far to the west to ever get hit by a hurricane. Okay, it's time. It's exactly 11:45. So I thank you for attending. I hope to see some of you in one of our local offices. So probably not on Aruba, although it's a beautiful island. So if on the 6th of February you have nothing better to do, take a plane and hop to Aruba, and we can meet face to face. Sharma, you can do the last one.
Yes, I see we had a very interesting webinar today. A lot of questions. That was nice to have an interaction. I placed the link in the chat. This link is to participate in our Inova raffle. It's basically just filling in an evaluation form of the webinar of today, and you get a chance to win a wellness package from Rituals. So, guys, please be sure to fill in the form, and we will be sending the name of the winner in the email that you will receive shortly. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a very pleasant day.